Join me as we travel to an alternate version of Roshar, in a different alternate dimension of the Cosmere, where nothing is the same, but everything is different from what you have known. And we are here. Stay tuned as we learn all about this alternate, parallel universe reality of Roshar. Welcome to another episode of Drew's Book Reviews. So now that we are here at the world of Roshar, it is time to talk about this alternate version and this alternate reality of Brandon Sanderson's The Way of Kings. So this is a book, Way of Kings Prime. This was offered as a free download on Brandon Sanderson's website for his fans. Now, Sanderson himself refers to this book as a spectacular failure. I'm not really sure that I can completely agree with that, but this was the first version of The Way of Kings that Sanderson wrote before, something like a decade before it was first published. So as we could kind of look at it as a rough draft, the first attempt at writing The Way of Kings. Now, to say that there are differences between the official story, The Way of Kings as we know it today, versus The Way of Kings Prime is an understatement. There are so many differences, everything from the characters' names to the world that's been created to even the plot and the overall storyline within the entire book. Just an example, we have a character named Merrin, who is this world's version of Kaladin, who becomes this shard bearer and raised to the level of nobleman. Now, there's no light eyes versus dark eyes in this version of The Way of Kings. So Merrin, he doesn't know how to be a nobleman, he doesn't know what to do with himself, and just finds himself thrust in this position, but he's trying to impress the other nobles around him, and basically he wants to be accepted by them, which is quite a contrast to what we see from Kaladin from the original Way of Kings, who wants nothing to do with nobility, and he doesn't want to be a part of it, whereas Merrin here, he just doesn't feel worthy of it, not so much that he rejects the idea of nobility as a whole. And then we have the character of Renarin. So again, some of the characters' names are the same, but in this case, it's Renarin who is the one that is going crazy with these visions of things to come. And even at one point where he finds himself in prison with Merrin, he's scratching and writing on the walls in his own blood. He's literally gone insane. So those are some of the differences here that we have between, well, there's actually a lot of differences between The Way of Kings as we've come to know it and The Way of Kings Prime. Again, I have to emphasize that this was offered as a free download. It is a book that Sanderson himself has called a spectacular failure. It is not his best work, or admittedly so, and honestly, I think we might see the same thoughts or feelings behind every first draft that Sanderson does. So it was definitely an interesting read, seeing where it all started from. Just before we kind of get into more of my feelings on the writing itself, just a little bit of the few differences. There are no Spren in this world, so that's one noticeable difference. The Oath Gates are not something that had to be discovered or found or reactivated by the Knights Radiance. The Knights themselves don't really seem to play a role. There are still things like Windrunners within this book, but the Knights Radiant themselves are not within this story. And the Oath Gates are already active and used on a regular basis. And then we have Shinri, who has married the Mad King well, at least I would call him the Mad King, often referred to as the Idiot King. Shinri, who plays the role, is Shallan's counterpart. She marries this cruel king who is out to basically control and rule the world. It almost kind of had a Game of Thrones-ish feel to it. When we consider the role of Joffrey in Game of Thrones, you can kind of think of that as the role of this idiot king, the idiot king in this book, and Shinri, who finds herself a red-headed young noblewoman who finds herself married off to this evil man. So definitely there is some of that Game of Thrones-esque feel to it with respect to Shinri's storyline specifically, and her challenges of overcoming that in the long run. The high storms of this version of Roshar seem to be much weaker. There's a few situations in which we find that our characters are able to be out in a high storm and survive without issue. Whereas with the Way of Kings, so the official version, we see that the high storms are something that is the legitimate, serious threat. And something that you can't just hang out outside in the high storm and live to tell about it. Well, unless you're Kaladin, of course. But overall, like, it is very, very, very different. And if you have not read The Way of Kings, I will definitely link my review to The Way of Kings in the description below. But if you have not if you have not read The Way of Kings, absolutely read The Way of Kings first. In fact, read all of the Stormlight Archive first. This is not a book that you want to read first. If you read this first, you might find that you never want to pick up the rest of the actual official series. So Sanderson has said that this is not canon within his Stormlight Archive. This is a first attempt at writing the story that he ultimately wanted to tell. And it definitely reads like a first attempt story. I mean, the character work is okay. The writing style, you know, it's definitely Sanderson writing style. Like, it's long. It's got a lot of work, high word count to it. But definitely you can tell that it is not the final product. And if this were the final product, I don't think I would have ever continued with the rest of the Way of Kings storyline. I don't think I would have picked up the rest of the Stormlight Archive if this had been the final product. It's just definitely, it's not up to par as far as it being a final draft. And that is something that comes across very evidently in the writing. The magic system isn't all that well fleshed out. And there are just, the characters, yeah, they're alright, they're okay. But definitely it feels more like it is a story-driven story rather than a character-driven story in a lot of times. I did have some times where I was finding it to be kind of boring and not that much interest. Now, it might be because I've already read the entire Stormlight Archive, and it's just not something that would interest me, knowing that it's a piece of work that Sanderson wasn't happy with himself. And that might have been it going into it, but honestly, I'm glad I read what Brandon Sanderson had to say about this story before reading it. I really am. And might have influenced my thoughts when it comes to actually just reviewing the book, quite possibly. I don't know. But I'm happy that I read what he had to say about it before going into the story itself and before picking up and reading it. It is definitely not something that you want to read as a first Sanderson read. Definitely worthwhile reading the whole Stormlight Archive first. Now, it definitely was not all bad. There's actually one aspect of this story that I really, really liked, and it was the storyline of Town. So he's one of the heralds that has come to save the world from the coming of the Storm Shades. So, of course, the Storm Shades are this world's version of the Voidbringers. Now, there aren't actually any Parshendi within this book. There's no Shattered Plains within this story. But basically we have Yasna, who gets kind of mixed up in this adventure with Town, who is moving across the world and gathering this army to fight the Storm Shades at the return of the Heralds. But of course none of the other Heralds have returned. He has no powers or magical ability, but this idea that he is one of the Heralds has been promoted, which kind of spurs this religious fervor and these people gathering to join this army as it marches across the land. while Lethkar has gone into civil war between Elhokar and Dalinar, who have gone into civil war against each other. So, with respect to the characters, of course, Yasna, Elhokar, Dalinar, so some of the character names have certainly stayed the same, but that storyline of town specifically is really good. I actually really enjoyed that aspect of this story. And I would have to say probably my favorite character and part of this story is the crazy man who believes himself to be a herald that Yasna gets swept away in. Yasna is still a heretic, but in this case, she seems to be slowly converting to the ideas of Vorinism throughout this book. So that's definitely contrasted with the Yasna we know of from the final product of The Way of Kings. But I really like that aspect of it. That's probably my favorite part of this Way of Kings Prime, is specifically the Herald Return storyline and the Stormshades. But with that being said, like overall, you know, I give the overall book about a 2.5 out of 5. Can't really do a half star on Goodreads, so I did round it up for 3. I really don't think or feel though that this is a spectacular failure. As Brandon Sanderson said, I think that anything that we learn from and get better at writing as a result is by far a good thing. I think that that is one of the best ways that we could learn and grow from our mistakes, from the things that we just felt we can do better, and we learn from that, we build upon that. And so while The Way of Kings Prime really is this alternate dimension or alternative history or version of The Way of Kings, which it really is, and is very different from The Way of Kings. It's something that Sanderson really learned from, and you can tell by the contrasting the vast difference between The Way of Kings Prime versus The Way of Kings final product. And definitely the final product of The Way of Kings is far superior writing. By a long shot. It is a much better, more planned out, better book. The magic system is far more fleshed out. The characters are far more developed. The world building is far more developed in The Way of Kings versus the version that we have with The Way of Kings Prime. It definitely reads like a first attempt, 100%, but overall I wouldn't call it a spectacular failure, but rather I would call it a first attempt, and just kind of leave it at that. And I'm glad that he didn't publish this one as the Way of Kings, because this series probably wouldn't have been nearly as successful as it has been if he had tried publishing this one as the first volume. So I'm really glad that he didn't, and overall, about 2.5 stars. It was really interesting going back and seeing where it all started, and for that reason alone, I think that is worthwhile reading for Sanderson fans who have completed the Stormlight Archive. Go see where it all started and really kind of see where it evolved from, and I thought, for me at least, that was a very fascinating aspect of it. And that was one of my biggest reasons for checking it out. I really wanted to see how it all got started. And with Brandon Sanderson releasing that, you just don't see authors out there releasing the first version of their story, so I thought that was really cool. And in the end, Way of Kings Prime, worth reading for Sanderson fans, but only if you have read the Stormlight Archive first. Worth reading with the mindset and understanding that this is not going to be Sanderson's best work. This is not going to be this phenomenal story, but it's just for the curiosity's sake, as the title says, a Sanderson curiosity, just to see where it all started. So those are just some of my thoughts on The Way of Kings Prime, and yeah, I'm glad I read it in the end. Even though it's definitely not his best work, I'm glad that I read and saw where it all began. So in any case, I hope you guys enjoyed this review. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and we will see you next time on the next episode of Drew's Book Reviews. Until then, keep on reading. Bye!